right, so I'm calling an emergency podcast. Not really an emergency, but an emergency in terms of enough to disrupt my vacation as I'm in Switzerland here for a month, traveling with a good buddy of mine from high school, my buddy Parker, and we're here in Switzerland, and we're doing kind of a tour of France, Italy, Spain, etc. And I've got a bunch of pre-recorded podcasts, but this thing in the news today, this FDA meeting on MDMA therapy, super fascinating. This is one of the niche topics, like drug regulation, FDA, big pharma, psychedelics, mental health, therapy. These are all like, I'm sort of in this space. I find all those things interesting, and this really encapsulates all those pieces together. This topic being so fascinating, and something that I've covered a little bit. I've interviewed Rick Doblin. That podcast is actually yet to be released, so I'll do that in time. But I really wanted to take a break from my a break from my vacation, and actually do a podcast on this with someone who I think is the best for this, Dr. Matt Johnson. He's been on before. He's a leading top psychedelic researcher. He's done phenomenal work at Johns Hopkins, doing the amazing studies on psilocybin for smoking cessation, all the studies on mystical experience and depression. And obviously you've been on a number of podcasts, Lex Friedman, Aubrey Marcus. We've had you on before, as I said. And I think, and then, so you've listened to most of this FDA meeting, which was over or about 9 hours. I've been on vacation, so I didn't listen to all of it. I saw bits and pieces, and I've been examining the discourse and reading the coverage and looking at various things. But I really wanted to have you on. For people who don't know, Dr. Matt Johnson, professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, and scientist at Shepherd Pratt, doing studies on psilocybin. And in general, I think the reason why I really value your voice and why I want to have you on for this very important podcast that I'm going to release in the next couple of days, because this is in the news and is a very hot topic. Because I think you are definitely not in either of the extremes of either, some people, which obviously you wouldn't be in this area if you were in that field, in that specific mindset, but people very critical or scared of psychedelics, or think it's all, sort of 80s, 90s discourse of if you take LSD, you'll go crazy, and these things will access various points in your mind that you won't be able to return from, etc. Versus the other end of the extreme, which is people who think this is a magic pill for every issue, and it'll save humanity, which I think is not totally impossible. I think that there's some truth in that, but there are the more grandiose sort of religious types within the research field. I think you're a fairly objective, moderate voice in the field, so I'm glad to have you on.
Thanks, and it's an honor that you're taking any time at all when the Swiss Alps are literally the competition for your time. So I feel honored.
Yeah, the Swiss Alps are a big competition, but I'll do that tomorrow. But I wanted to get this done today while I have. Obviously, my friends are a little disappointed, but it's okay. I'll take an hour here. So you listened to most of the FDA meeting.
Yeah. And caught up today on some of the few parts I had to step out for. So I think I've seen about all of it at this point.
Yep. So for some basics for audience who doesn't know, who may not have followed or don't know anything about this, MDMA therapy brought by Rick Doblin, his group MAPS, and particularly this for-profit he's created. I always butcher the name, but Lycos. Lycos.
Their public benefit corp side of the for-profit world. Yeah.
Yeah. So Rick at MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, has done these what I do think are incredible studies on MDMA-assisted therapy used to treat PTSD. And those studies are incredibly promising, show high efficacy. 86% of individuals in those studies, in the recent phase 3 study, had a substantial reduction in PTSD symptoms. By the end of the study, 72% no longer qualified for PTSD, compared to about 48% in placebo, which is also a sizable amount, and something we'll talk about, which is brought up by the FDA. And for people, obviously, who have no idea what we're saying, so MDMA, which is known as ecstasy, has been used in party drug settings but also has shown incredible promise and is proving to be very powerful therapeutically because it allows individuals to enter into a very safe, calm state with the kind of fear centers of the brain lowered, which would help a lot of people with anxiety and PTSD, and allows you to examine and really deeply reflect things that you've been running away from, things that you're scared about, nightmares that you've been having. It really kind of opens the books to your heart, and you kind of get to explore these things.
Allowing you to
Something that I've done
reprocess.
personally.
Yep.
Reprocess. This is something I've done a couple times personally and written about it once. So I do have a bit of an experience and a bias there, is that I do think in the right setting, these things are very powerful. And so these studies, the phase 3 studies that showed incredible promise for MDMA, specifically used for PTSD. And when this podcast releases with Rick Doblin that I've done a few months ago, that kind of got put in this backlog, waiting for the production relaunch of the show. In that podcast, he actually explains, which is really interesting, why he chose PTSD why he matched MDMA and PTSD together, because it's, it was psilocybin, there's DMT, there's all these things, and there's all these issues. Obviously, for people who don't know, Dr. Matt Johnson, he's done psilocybin work, as I mentioned, for depression and smoking cessation. There's great research on psilocybin for alcoholism, alcohol use disorder as well. And so it's just super fascinating to see how these things can really help people. They allow you to self-reflect, but what drug, what psychedelic, and by psychedelic we can say kind of a proxy for an experience, or a drug that provides an experience that allows you to self-reflect and process difficult things, but sort of mapping and matching which psychedelic for which condition. Again, Rick explains in the podcast that I'll release soon why MDMA and PTSD together versus like psilocybin, smoking cessation. Like there's all these different things. But so that's kind of the basics, MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And there was this FDA advisory meeting for approval of MDMA-assisted therapy. And Rick, when he was on the podcast, which again I'll release soon, he said that that approval by the FDA for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD is very likely, and he's very confident about it. Now with this public committee, which comprises of a number of individuals that aren't directly employed by the FDA, but a committee that's chosen, a number of scientists and researchers that they put together, similar to the COVID vax. And there were a lot of issues with the committees and what they were saying on the COVID vaccine. But this is an independent group of researchers selected by the FDA, obviously. So they're picking people specifically.
Yeah. And much like NIH review panels, I've served on this type of thing for many years. So there's a lot of kind of analogous situations. Yeah. So they put together a panel of experts. Yeah.
So the panel voted 9-2 on whether MDMA-assisted therapy was effective. 9
and then 10-1
9 on the negative.
9 saying no, it wasn't effective. Yeah.
And 10-1 on whether I'm reading from this New York Times piece. 10-1 on whether the proposed treatment's benefits outweighed its risks. So 10 people.
So even one of those that said it was one of the two that thought it was effective said, but not worth enough to justify the risks. So that was even worse. Yeah. Which you need both. I mean, now to be clear, the advisory panel vote is not binding, but the whole point is to advise the FDAs. They could take a different decision, but it doesn't look good at all for at least this round of, who knows I would imagine at some point MDMA will be approved for PTSD, but I wouldn't be putting bets on it for that decision in August, which is where they have until they're taking this and all of the data and anything else, and they're making that decision by August. But it surprised a lot of people in terms of how negative it was. And I think a big part of that was this ICER report, this organization that put out a report, I don't know, a month ago or several weeks back anyway, that was I think it surprised a lot of people and the negativity. And it surprised me in terms of how they weighted certain concerns. Same thing with the panel. I think there was a lot of kernel of truth to a lot of that concerns that they brought up, but I still would have voted on the side of recommending approval with the provision that with the right REMS, and those refer to the REMS, risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. That's the FDA lingo for the set of rules that they could slap on. They could approve it, but only under these conditions following these rules. And so I think with the right REMS program that one could address all of the concerns, and that it's approvable, and the benefits outweigh the risk. But yeah, there were other domains we can get into that were very contentious.
Yep. One bigger picture thing, which I read in the New York Times, which is that the stats are 69% roughly is the rate of FDA going ahead and approving a drug that the committee rejects. So that's kind of the average rate of this getting approved. Obviously, this is it's case by case, but that's the rate.
So, 69% where they would agree with the panel, or do the where they would agree. Well, so 69%
in this scenario when the panel says no, when the panel rejects, overwhelmingly,
the likelihood that FDA will say,
will differ from the panel and actually approve
60. Okay, so I read some stats suggesting that the large majority, not all the time, but that they typically vote in the same direction. In other words, like it's more likely the FDA will not approve. And again, I can't cite, this is what I've seen in the media, because certainly tracking the percentages of these advisory panels where the FDA agrees or disagrees, that's not what I focus on. So don't quote me, but I think I read that 80% of the time they vote in the same direction as the advisory panel. The other thing, no matter what the number is, you also got to agree. Like those.
Yeah, I did read that somewhere, and I'll pull it up if I can find it. But
those times when they disagree, I have to imagine, and I think this is probably a good guess. I can't cite hard data, but those are probably more the 5 to 6, 7 to 4 votes. Like when you get a 10 to 1 and a 9 to 2, I'm guessing that the likelihood that they're going to disagree is much less than those more marginal vote counts.
Right. And again, from what I read in this one article, the percentage for the FDA agreeing when a panel approves of recommends approval for a drug, that's like 95, 98%.
Okay.
In that case.
Okay.
For the no case, it's still, from what I read, 65, 68%.
Okay.
Something like that.
Which suggests there's a ray of hope. But again, I wonder if a good number of those are the more marginal cases. How often do they vote to approve when they get a 10 to 1, 9 to 2 disapproval?
So let's jump in. Let's just jump in here. There's a lot to talk about. I'll just give you the floor here. So what's your general overview of what happened? I know it's 9 hours long, so it's a hard thing to answer. But in terms, I guess, if you want to start structuring this conversation and guiding it a little bit, I guess you could say one thing I've been thinking about, and one thing that I do see from my cursory analysis, is that the range of concerns raised by FDA committee members is from fairly valid and legitimate to absurd and doesn't really make sense. You could say illegitimate.
Yeah.
And all that's in a context, and I'll probably do another video monologue on this or something, of like just comparing this to the approval process of the COVID vaccines, which didn't have this so careful, fine-grained, precise, meticulous consideration of all the concerns and safety. It's like for the COVID vaccine, you saw the exact opposite: dismissal and downplaying and neglect of side effects and risks. And here I'm seeing the opposite. And so I've talked to a few different people of various opinions on this, and some say it's a good thing that the FDA is being this critical and this fine-grained. That's actually a good precedent, except we would like the FDA to do that for SSRIs and ADHD medications and even the COVID vaccine if we're going to mass administer, various things and mandate it, et cetera. So that's that. So what's your sense of concerns raised from, did you kind of agree with that range and where, and so I want to hear you talk about what your view on various concerns are, and I'll bring up a few of them as well. And do you think, generally that the concerns were more on the absurd and ridiculous side, or more on the legitimate and rational side?
I think it spanned that range, but honestly, sort of the same. I was on NIH study section for 5 years, and I did more ad hoc reviews for several years before that. Like, so I've reviewed hundreds of government grants, not the exact same thing, but a very similar thing. So the biggest thing I want to share with people is that, I've seen a good amount of conspiracy sort of like, and a lot of conspiracies are real, don't get me wrong, but sometimes the smoke-filled conspiracy, like the explanations are like more boring things like, just human inefficiency and, biases. And sometimes often it's not the smoke-filled room conspiracy. So I don't think it was big pharma. Yes, people are used to reviewing things that are more look like big pharma and fit into the model of traditional treatment. And this is different. So it's not that it doesn't have anything to do with it, but I don't think there was any bias for the FDA to tank this. I've seen stuff like, they just want to keep promoting SSRIs. They're biased against this. I think what I saw was what I typically have seen in review in many committees.
Just to pause for a second, we do know the FDA has a lot of financial incentives, a lot of perverse financial and political incentives. I mean, if the COVID vaccine is any indication of anything, what happened there? I mean, two officials who left the FDA saying that the agency was too zealous in pushing boosters for all kinds of political and financial reasons. And yeah,
I agree. We need to do a lot to improve the system, but typically that is those incentives are in line with approving a product. Because as a this is more for the people at the FDA likely than the advisory panel, but like, oh, I could get a job doubling or tripling my salary in a year or two, from this company who's the drug sponsor that I'm reviewing right now. And if I'm really harsh, that might make it more. I mean, to me, that's the biggest thing. So it's typically in the direction of like favoring the sponsor and the overall thing about like the companies paying for the process. A big part of the FDA budget comes from the companies paying for the entire process to evaluate. Like, again, all of that is in the direction of approval, not of disapproving something. And so you have a little more burden to say in terms of constructing the theory that like, well, they're incentivized to block this because it's a competition with other drugs. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence for that. I know that there's a lot of forces within the FDA that are really open and that want these treatments explored. And so my main take is the negativity is the same type of that you typically get in review committees. It's science by committee.
Yeah, and I'll just pause for a second there on what you just said, and I think, and I agree. I think you're probably right about that. I mean, there's a lot of frustrations and a lot of warranted anger and frustration and disapproval of the FDA and what they've become, especially what was highlighted during the COVID process, but also with SSRIs and various other medications that have various side effects that haven't been properly studied and assessed and disclosed. There's a lot of people in various kind of communities now, whether it's in the COVID vaccine or also some interesting sub communities online, feel very disenfranchised about SSRIs and the lack of disclosure on side effects like sexual dysfunction and withdrawal. There's a lot of concerns about the FDA has not done a good job of this. And when it comes to this, particular conversation of, again, like I said, why did FDA committee members and actual employees at the FDA, have a very different approach to other things like SSRIs or COVID vaccines versus this, and what kind of biases do play a role in all of this. And I know I'm going to do some more digging into this, but I already had a bit of suspicion on these various individuals as part of the independent committee, what kind of biases they might have and what kind of other previous experiences with pharma companies. And from what I've seen, one individual, forgetting her name, was paid by J&J, and I don't know much more than that yet. But there could be, let's say, theoretically, some concerns over what kind of involvement with pharmaceutical companies various individuals on a committee might have, and assuming that, and sorry, I'm saying if this is the case, if theoretically, if some individuals have been paid by SSRI companies to do research in a certain area, that would obviously bring about some conflicts of interest of like, if you're going into a committee meeting and about to approve MDMA therapy versus you've been paid, again, this is in theory, and you've been paid by Pfizer for Zoloft to, for SSRIs, which is the current approved treatment for PTSD. So how are you going to really be that objective if you've done research in a certain area and you publish that research and, showing positive findings for these things for PTSD? So anyway.
Well, I personally think publishing in your, when it conflicts with your own area, when it directly conflicts with your own research, is likely more of a in most cases, that's going to represent more bias than if someone's advised for another company. I mean, my experience in advisory relationships is like, I've never gotten any pressure. I mean, these are psychedelic related companies that, oh, don't say this about this other, company. It's like, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I think if you're like kind of like a world's expert in an area, like in PTSD treatment, a lot of folks will advise to. My advice for people, if you're doing advising, do it for multiple entities, because then it's like it's less likely. It's like the argument you're going to be in any one particular company's pocket. It's better to say, no, I'm for a PTSD treatment, sort of my expertise is helpful, like whatever, but you're not kind of seen in this lens of just doing the bidding of any particular organization or company. But so, I think all that should be taken into account. And maybe, I could imagine an argument, it would be the cleanest not to have any conflicts of relationship. You do have to balance that, although you also recognize, especially because of sometimes folks aren't paid what they really deserve, especially if they're, depending on what institution they're at. It's like a lot of times you pull out a lot of the most well-qualified experts if you require a completely pure, like no, conflicts of interest that you've never done any, even like 10 years ago, like whatever. So, there is an argument to be made there. It might be best, to be, on the ultra pure side and say, okay, don't have anyone with any conflicts. But, the typical, my impression is that most of what I saw was just like what you would expect at an NIH review committee. It's kind of the insidious human psychology, this group psychology of death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to disrupt you, but just to clarify again, just so people know. So my friend Callie Means tweeted this out. I don't know who should be credited for discovering this in the first place, but a member of the FDA advisory panel, Dr. Carla M. Canuso, MD. She's an employee of Johnson & Johnson. That's worse than I thought it was. Anyway,
I don't think that doesn't sound like a good idea to me. I think
that's okay. That's very concerning to me now. Very concerning. So I want to look into that more before I say more about that, and cast judgments. But as he said, J&J does directly compete in the antidepressant market, and antidepressants are those are the only current approved FDA treatments for MDMA therapy.
Right, there's about 4 of them, that are approved.
So that's highly concerning to me, and I want to investigate further into that.
Right. Yeah, so I can't say that there's, there aren't any biases in that direction. What was just struck out to me, at least on broad strokes, is it's sort of, again, science by committee. And a lot of folks, I feel like I wish there was more expertise for psychedelics represented, because there were certain things that were said that I felt like they weren't really understanding the data or what was going on. Mm-hmm. But So in terms of, like, let's structure this conversation, and I know we want to be succinct, and I am on vacation, but I do want to do a good job here. One structure might be just like there's like just this limited number of domains of concern, like 4 or 5 of them. That.
Yeah. So let me start with, so why don't you walk me through some legitimate concerns that they had, and then we'll get to the illegitimate ones.
Yeah.
And actually first, the first cursory question, which I asked before, to reiterate, was there general sense that it leaned more in the absurd and illegitimate, or the more like very valid and serious?
I would say it leaned more towards most of these are things that deserve discussion, but I would have weighed them ultimately differently in terms of the overall decision. Most of it not a few things maybe at the extreme, but most of it kind of reasonable and kind of landing on a different side. And so the stuff that, like, one of the things that I thought was probably, I guess, the most absurd, other, again, legitimate to talk about and discuss, but given the data, I don't think it would have detracted me at all, away from approval, is prior use of MDMA. So about 40% of people in the trials across the 2 phase 3 trials had used MDMA before. And one of the things I was disappointed at, it sounded like the discussants, when they were discussing it, as if it sounded like there was a discussion and a misunderstanding, as if most of these people or all had used MDMA to treat their PTSD. And the more, likely thing is that, it's virtually all what you'd call like party use, or just, they were curious.
Partying in Ibiza.
Yeah, whether it's like recreational or not, call it what you will. But, they're curious. They tried it, 15 years ago. They had a limit. It couldn't have been more than 10 times in their lifetime. But the most typical thing is probably someone took it, whatever. They went to a club. Their buddy said, "Oh, you want to try this?" And they tried it, and they did that a couple times, 2-3 times. And so that's very, very different than saying, oh, like almost half these people have actually tried this treatment for the treatment of PTSD. But the big piece of data, which they showed during the meeting, was that the average, the effect, the mean improvement in symptoms, both the mean and the variance surrounding that mean, was nearly identical between those 40% who had used MDMA some other time in their life and those 60%, most people, who hadn't. So it seems crystal clear from the data that it's not this previous use of MDMA that's kind of, creating this biased, population that's, especially likely to be improved by MDMA. And in fact, I think there was a trivial, certainly statistically insignificant difference. But I think even in terms of the directions of the means, I think the people who had never used it had a little bit better improvement. But the main story is that they were nearly identical. But I think it was even in that direction, like the opposite of what you would expect if these.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So the now it gets nuanced, because there was also discussion of, it's not just in terms of biasing efficacy, it's biasing safety. In other words, somehow people who have used MDMA before, if they had like a really a negative previous experience with MDMA, they're less likely to volunteer for the trial, and therefore you're not going to see as high of rate of adverse events, because you've self-selected a population, or the population has self-selected to be one that is less likely to have negative outcomes of whatever type from MDMA, because presumably they would have not volunteered if they know, oh, MDMA is really horrible for me. Like, I don't think that's very credible. I get the logic, but in fact, MDMA is actually known, even in recreational settings, with all the hazards and everything, for their being astonishingly few negative reactions. It's one of the reasons it took off as a drug of abuse so quickly, is that most people really like it when they've had the real, actually had MDMA. And even the most common, what we would call adverse effects, and at a certain degree, if they're serious enough, serious adverse effects, such as a robust cardiac response, your heart rate getting up too high, your blood pressure getting too high. That stuff's not even going to be recognized as a bad thing, or even like measured or noticed by most people in a recreational setting. So the whole idea that that's a strong enough effect that you had all these people with negative experiences with MDMA who were then less likely to volunteer, for treatment, doesn't make sense. And also the idea is, like, even if you have had a negative experience with MDMA, while dancing all night on it or whatever, and also drinking and et cetera, which is more of a typical thing in a recreational setting, the whole idea that those people would say, oh, this medically monitored trial with a physician right there and with medical monitoring and heart rate being measured, like, I'm afraid to go into this trial, because I had a negative reaction of some type. And like, that doesn't seem plausible to me. That it just doesn't seem like you're going to get like some substantial number of people fitting that pattern enough to drive the data in this study. So I'm not, so I think that being a major concern is on the more absurd. I should say I wouldn't have agreed with it. I would have argued it vigorously if I was on the panel, that those reasons I just told you.
For sure. Let's segue into the other concern, which is brought up about you already alluded to it, cardiovascular risk. Some FDA panel members were concerned about
this
that.
Was weird because the FDA apparently acknowledged that it was both the sponsor and them. Like, we should have asked them for more data. Like, I believe it was EKGs at the end of their sessions and labs, like blood samples after their sessions. And I mean, part of the phase 3 trial is like the sponsor really says, okay, gets from FDA, oh, this is what you want. Oh, here's our plan. Tell us if there's problems with this, or if you want any changes. And if they approve it, it's sort of, so it's really crappy for the FDA to say, oh, we should have asked for this, but not. But even with that, like with an appropriate REMS, you could put with the rules that you could attach, you could require, EKGs, coming in and coming out, potentially. And the other thing is, and there was a cardiologist that was speaking at the meeting, I think on behalf of Lykos, who made the argument, and I'm no cardiologist, I'm an experimental psychologist, but it made sense to me, and I think fits the overall toxicology data on MDMA, that even in like recreational settings, that typically, you're if you have a cardiac event, it's most likely going to happen when they're on the substance. And like, even if there's a disturbance of their typical EKG response, the whole idea that you're going to have something showing up the next day, and even if you were able to pick up on some abnormality at the end of the session as they're coming down from this like several hours long, powerful drug reaction, the whole idea that that's going to then lead to a clinical event, like someone having a stroke or something, is just like astonishingly unlikely. That fits with the data. For me, it seems very likely that with medical monitoring, I mean, this is safer than any recreational use of this compound under the ideal conditions. And you're going to have screening again. That can all be in the rules, the REMS. And it's like, to me, that was disappointing to hear this concern about we wanted extra data on labs afterwards. I mean, that would have been nice to know and for them to have had those data. But it doesn't strike me that, given that safety profile and the fact that you could add that to the rule, some of these additional monitoring criteria to the rules, it doesn't make sense that you would, tank it based on that concern.
Yeah. Two things on that. Number one, do we have robust safety data for MDMA and its cardiovascular risks?
I would argue yes, because many, many millions of dollars, tens and tens of millions of dollars have been spent by the NIH, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, to look specifically at the harms of MDMA. And we know a lot about it. So I would argue under the exclusion criteria, with people who have been medically screened and that have had their heart function looked at, had a screening EKG, like, yes, and who have been not excluded based on, cardiac risk factors determined through that physical and that heart assessment. Like, yes, it's a reasonable, it puts a load on your heart response. It raises blood pressure. It increases heart rate, but it's a reasonable risk benefit ratio, especially when they're being medically monitored. And I have to say, a lot of these risks that you get with that cardiac response are of the same nature that you get from the close cousin D-amphetamine, which, Adderall, which not only are we giving clinically, we do it too much, but we give it to kids who are not being medically monitored. Here, Johnny, take this in the morning and then go to school. And, those kids have had a physical. They determined they're not at high heart risk disease, but we're giving them this stuff and then sending them to school with it. This is like people taking MDMA, being medically monitored, and if something goes wrong, oh, there's a physician down the hall who can respond. Or you can, they're going to call for professionals who can call for that physician to come and have an emergency response. So we have to be balanced about this, and there is a heart risk, but I think it could,
So there have been robust studies medically monitoring the heart activity of individuals with MDMA, and there is no significant percentage of adverse events happening? Do we have any idea on
right with people with this type of monitoring?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not familiar with anyone ever, like a single participant under the type of guidance exclusion criteria for either a therapeutic or a non-therapeutic, or we're administering MDMA to assess the effects on social processing or emotion, whatever, more of a pure psychology experiment. I'm not familiar of anyone having a serious, like, life-threatening AE, like they have a stroke or something, that, like, has ever happened. I'm not familiar with a single case. Now that's, sometimes people have these events after taking street MDMA, which often has other things, straight up stimulants, cathinone, so-called bath salts, other, methamphetamine. But even that's an astonishingly small rate for the, in terms of having, especially when we talk about lethal reactions to MDMA or even nominal MDMA, is astonishingly low. It can happen. It does happen. But those are relatively small numbers out of the millions of people who use MDMA. So this is just a very different. I would say it's been very well characterized, and its cardiovascular response and is safe for people who are excluded. People with severe heart disease should not go into an MDMA trial, but that's one of the really easy things to assess. That's way easier than many of the psychiatric things we screen out.
So what is that risk based on? I remember Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. He didn't end up doing MDMA because I forget what the exact specifics, but there is this theoretical risk of heart attack, heart failure, something.
Yeah, his physician said something about his ticker. I forget the exact, but there's some abnormality or something to keep her, especially for a man in his, I assume, 60s at the time. It's like,
yeah. So what is that risk based on for heart attack or something happening in terms of cardiac activity?
Well, it's the same constellation of symptoms that can occur with any stimulant. So part of MDMA's activity is through that dopaminergic, noradrenergic kind of stimulant pathway. In part, what makes it different from amphetamine or methamphetamine, which are the prototypical stimulants, but very, very related to cocaine and a host of other, like therapeutically, Ritalin is very, very similar to cocaine, the way it acts, but they're all amphetamine type compounds. The way MDMA differs, it has much more of a serotonin response and less of that more dopamine, noradrenergic mediated stimulant response, but it still has that stimulant response. And so it does it relative to, say, something like psilocybin, which increases blood pressure. MDMA can do so even more. So it's part, it's, as Terrence McKenna used to say, it's hard to take the A out of amphetamine, and this is methylene methamphetamine, so it is a type of amphetamine. It has that stimulant aspect. So, so there's a constellation of things that can go wrong with that, just getting a heart rate that's so high or blood pressure is so high, it's putting you at risk for a stroke, the EKG abnormalities, arrhythmias, a whole constellation of heart problems that can happen, especially in someone with heart vulnerability, that if you're giving them, a stimulant, you're increasing the likelihood they could have one of those reactions.
It does elevate the heart rate quite a bit.
Yeah.
That's I've witnessed that during heart monitor watch while doing MDMA, but that's part of the experience. So my general, just raw feeling, I mean, of course, what you just said, if you've had heart issues, probably best to stay away from it. And I also made a point of just being more having stronger cardiac conditioning beforehand, being in a much more healthier state, especially if you're obese and you're on the couch all day and you're not getting enough physical activity, and even just getting up the stairs causes you to be out of breath, then going into an MDMA session where heart rate's going to go up a lot. That, like, theoretically, I could see that as being a potential risk.
Right. And these are all things a proper screening would take in, including age is the other big factor wasn't mentioned. It's like way different, even if you are obese and everything, if you're in your 20s, it's like way different risk factor than if you're in your 60s with the same constellation of other risk factors. And, and you're going to get obviously a lot more people with hypertension when they're in their 40s and 50s and 60s.
Two things on this, just to close the loop, and I know this is to your knowledge, so you're not 100% sure, but sounds like you're pretty sure. In any of the MDMA safety studies, there's never been a heart attack, stroke, cardiac related death, like such a severe.
I believe that's outcome. True. You always be careful, and it's harder to know a negative for sure. That's but. Not that I know of, which doesn't speak to how MDMA is always safe. It speaks to the fact that these under a highly constrained, FDA approved studies where they are excluding people with those vulnerabilities and they are being monitored. And if heart rate did go up, they could give you a medication to help bring bring things down, or blood pressure. You can have rescue medication. So in that context, no, I don't think there's ever been a life-threatening, serious adverse reaction. Again, could be wrong, but I'm please let me know if there have been.
Yeah, that's a pretty remarkable fact, and not to stray too far from this, specific topic. That when it came to the COVID vaccines, we did know it was causing myocarditis. No one disagrees with that. There are different,
right, and risk-benefit ratio, and their argument was
Yeah. Depending on your political ideology, you weigh that differently, which is just disgusting. That's the case. Depending on your politics, that's either a nothing burger and it goes away and it's transient and not a big issue, versus it being a real issue, which it is. And we know for a fact from this fantastic South Korea study that had a very close follow up and a very close monitoring of cardiac outcomes, that people did die of cardiac related causes related to the vaccine, cardiac-related death from post-vaccination. We do know that happened for sure, and that likely skewed younger and male and fit. But we do know that happened. It is a fact that healthy people that didn't need the COVID vaccine, they were not at significant risk of COVID, did die of cardiac-related issues from the vaccine. That number, I'm not going to pretend to know. I know that what that rate is. I mean, that rate is obviously, people are not dropping dead everywhere, but there seems to be an increase in that. To what exact percentage, I can't say, but that did happen, and the FDA could have prevented that. So
right.
In any case, I'm just comparing. I'm comparing this.
Yeah, and it's a good example, and hopefully one that, who knows when, hopefully historically we can weigh it as dispassionately as the real, important example of risk-benefit ratio and where we went wrong, and how to unfortunately it is so charged, it's hard to navigate those waters now. But was there really the evidence that the risk for 5-year-olds was high enough to not only allow it, but which it's not in some countries, but to actually mandate it to, get back to school or whatever, when the chances of being harmed by COVID were less than being struck by lightning and this type, it's for the little kids, it's just so, but it is it's an important for people that can wrap their minds around it and not start calling you names. If you just take a dispassionate look about it being a balance, it's a good example for, it's difficult. Cause to the degree, it seemed clear that particularly in the more vulnerable, this it seems like it's in it. I think the data suggests it did help a lot of people who were more vulnerable from dying from COVID, the older people with comorbidities.
Likely COVID naive who didn't have infection.
Right.
People who did have an infection. I'll even just use my colleague and hold him up. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is fantastic. His analysis suggests, or his views are that for likely for individuals who already were infected with COVID, the vaccine did not provide any substantial added effect, including for elderly people as well.
Which wouldn't be surprising at all by first principles, because they built an immunity, and which in many cases is actually better immunity than a vaccine, which makes sense. Even if it was a gamble getting it, you didn't mean to get it, but you actually dealt with the real pathogen, and your body actually mounted a robust, full-scale response that actually defeated that pathogen. And so now it's I'm no virologist, but that typically is the case. And so, but everything we're talking about is risk benefit balance, and so it's hey, maybe I think, but it's, maybe we should have been like, oh, like here's the people that should really get it, and here's the people where like, no, it doesn't. It's not simple. It's not like this thing is horrible and should never be used, and it's not like this needs to be put into drinking water. It's somewhere in between that, and it's about that risk-benefit balance, and that differs by the different, like, who you are and what's going on and what your history is. And same thing with MDMA. I think some of the discussion got a little too
before we get you canceled for being an anti-vaxxer in a field that you are in, which is mostly left-leaning, just being real here.
Yeah.
Before let's move on before you get ostracized in your field. Suddenly, people.
I am truly pro-science, meaning we have to hear out all of the evidence.
Yeah.
And like, I'm pro-vaccine. I'm pro-many vaccines, and I even like this. Yeah, I was pro-COVID vaccine. I'm just like, we gotta like look at the data.
Okay, one quick question. You can feel free to provide a very short answer on this, but just to close the loop on the safety, I forget the exact psychopharmacological terminology on this, but I have heard that like whatever the name of this is that I'm referring to, the risk of death essentially from MDMA is higher than say psilocybin. Like it takes less to kill you. So I'm curious what that's based on, or if there are documented cases from studies. I mean, you said no in terms of death, but
like the LD50, well, which is one way.
LD50,
that's like how much of it would it need to kill you, which is like only a theoretical number with psilocybin, because it's like it's such an absurd. It gets to numbers where it's like, okay, if this was in mushroom form, you physically couldn't eat that many mushrooms to kill you. So even the numbers that exist are just extrapolations. To MDMA being like most drugs, like, no, you can't take 3 or 4 times a full dose and expect to live or not be permanently damaged. Like most drugs, including alcohol, like if you get a good buzz from 5 drinks, don't expect to just like multiply that by 5 and expect to live. Like, I mean, there's college kids that die every year. They just like, they drink, especially if they don't have a tolerance. They drink the equivalent of 12 drinks over like an hour, and like, you could straight up die. Like, you can't caffeine. Like it happens with all of the more normal drugs. Like, most drugs, you can't just say, I'm going to take 10 times or even like got Tylenol. Like Tylenol, you take even 2 or 3 times, depending on your state of your liver. You can die from astonishingly small. Like, you don't have to take 20 times the dose, like a whole bottle. You could take just a few times the dose and be at risk of death or serious injury. So MDMA is more like that, but thankfully you do control your dose in these studies, and so it's not just like, oh, take this amount, man. It's like, these are real. This is exactly whatever it is, 80 milligrams or
Now you said 3 to 4 times. Was that just like a rough estimate?
I'm speaking roughly, times, but it's something like, you start to get, you give.
So you got to be careful, because 3 to 4.
Yeah, you take 200 milligrams of, people take things like 250, 300 milligrams of MDMA, but my God, they shouldn't. It's been really concerning when some of the batches out there have had capsules with that much in them. And it does clearly, like, some people are going to die with a dose like that, but you get up to, you don't have to go so far, even if most people make it through a dose like that. 500, like, I can't cite the numbers off the top of my head, but they're more normative like that. Like, they're not like cannabis. They're not like psilocybin, where it's some theoretical number where you're talking about hundreds of times a dose that could, get you high. It's like, no, it's more of like a handful, like, or a tripling of the dose might send you to the hospital, or for the wrong person, cause you to die. So it's
I'm forgetting the exact number, but I think for my personal MDMA therapy session, which was done in the proper setting, not recreationally, not in my buddy's basement,
right?
But
with the properly weighed out dose, and like,
that was, I believe, 100 milligrams and like a 50 gram, 75 gram booster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what that was, something like 150 to 175 milligrams total of MDMA.
And that's even more than the dose that MAPS eventually started, which I think was 80 and then half that as the booster. Don't quote me, but I think they surprised during their development program, actually were focused more on like 120 and actually found that they got a better response. Surprised them they got a better response at a somewhat lower dose, typically somewhat less than what is typical in a recreational dose even. So yeah, more response, more risk cardiovascularly compared to psilocybin, but I would argue ones that with the right selected people and with the right medical monitoring fall completely within an acceptable risk benefit analysis with well screened monitored people.
Hi everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal mental and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed generalized kind of medical advice, and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word Illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word Illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it. All right, back to the show.
Yeah. This podcast is also great on psychedelic safety. I mean, I wanted to narrowly focus on the FDA meeting, but these are very interesting topics. So I'm following up on some of these points. So people who are interested in the safety of these drugs, we've mentioned a little bit on psilocybin and MDMA, and I think that's very useful information for anyone who's curious or interested. Moving on away from that, so other risks that were, the structure that I gave you was any concerns that were valid. We are talking about some more invalid risks. Mm-hmm. So was there anything on the valid side? Well, and if not, then let's talk more about the invalid.
It wasn't all side. Risk, although one of the there was the credibility, the blind, the idea that was all driven by placebo effects. And then there was some just the other categories of big topics. There was kind of the idiosyncratic nature of the therapy, which in part involves internal family systems, and a lack of, it was standardized, but apparently not up to, didn't have as much of, at least for some of the reviewers, enough of the, compliance monitoring in terms of like whether the same exact, psychotherapies was delivered to both, groups. And then there were concerns about data quality, which is a very broad term, but the biggest thing there is there are people who have former patients who have complained, including a very salient one from their phase 2 research, not this, but in the previous, not the phase 3, but the phase 2 research that there was a sexual relationship between between one of the therapists. It was a married couple, but between one of the therapists and the patient.
Yeah.
And then it was eventually even discovered that there was inappropriate contact. There was spooning, which is just, it was horrific. My read on it, and I don't know what I don't know, but that MAPS, which they were at the time, now Lycos, that they made all the right moves once that happened. They obviously fired those therapists. They instituted a rule that you couldn't have a married couple, because part of the claim, which looked real, was that the lady didn't rat out her husband, because of their relationship, even though she knew about the relationship that he was having with the patient, but that they're not going to allow like that. And they have made other changes, like they would, like if a complaint is ever made, they're going to review the tape. Like the spooning wasn't found until they had MAPS released at the patient's request the tape, and then it was found. So MAPS didn't even self-identify it at that point. Now, I would say you can't realistically expect every session tape to be reviewed, but the rule that they did make is that if any type of complaint, by my understanding, any type of complaint is made, we will review all the tapes from that participant, whether a claim is made about something inappropriate during the session or not. So those all sounded, which would have allowed, in retrospect, the sponsor MAPS to have picked up on the spooning and like, oh my God, before it was, discovered by someone else. But to my knowledge, all of that pivoting and was sounded like an appropriate response.
From MAPS?
Yeah. Now, there's also apparently other claims that haven't been fully investigated of people saying they were harmed from the trial, or that they had a bad experience or became more suicidal, but that wasn't reflected in the data. And that's the stuff that I don't know about, and I don't think has been fully investigated. And it sounds like there's a plan for some of those complaints to still be looked at through, but I think that there was enough smoke around that stuff that really like made the reviewers think, oh, like, was this kind of bias in terms of some of these? Was there more going on, like this inappropriate stuff or harms that weren't, reported? And so I don't have any knowledge of any of that. And I do think that the one concrete case that I think the public has known a lot about, it seems like they put in the right rules to minimize as much as possible the chances of something like that happening again. But I will say this treatment is one where, and I've tried to warn people, psychedelic treatment in general, like you're going to have, if you don't really train therapists well, and if you allow the wrong type of people in, and if you don't monitor things, you are going to have some therapists that go the route of cult leader, or set themselves up as a spiritual guru, and this boundary violations, like having sexual relations, romantic relationship with patients. I think psychedelics can give you the whole idea that this is so much bigger than normal treatment, boring old treatment. Like this is like, and when someone's on the psychedelic experience, like we're connecting as humans, that, and like this idea that you're the therapist and I'm the patient are these superficial roles. And like, you really can develop this bond that you recognize as like that can lead someone without the right training, without the right ethics, frankly, to say, oh, screw it. Like this is real. That's the normal size. Leary would say, and Leary did lots of brilliant things, but he also made this mistake of saying, well, the normal rules don't apply. That's the normal science game, the normal clinical psychology game, the normal physician game. It's like, well, okay, some of these call them games, but these boring old systems, they have ethics that we've learned the hard way throughout decades and decades. One of which is like, don't get freaky with your patients. Like that is like never appropriate, so it's, like that's a risk here. Now, did MAPS do anything that didn't have enough safeguards for that? I mean, it sounds like at the beginning, I mean, you could always do better on any dimension. So again, they did change some of their rules. that sounded appropriate to me once that happened. But there's also this sense, and I think a little bit of concern that, and this is something else I've talked about, aside from like sexual violations, that just this is so big that the ends justifies the means. Like we're literally saving humanity by ushering these treatments. And that's so big that if you got to lie about the data, I'm not saying that Lykos has done this, but I'm saying I think that's where some of the concerns of some of the public complainants were along these lines. And for the field in general, this is definitely a concern. I've seen some personal instances in my work with colleagues. So there's a reality here that this can seem so important and so big and so different that the normal rules don't apply, and that you can hide this or maybe to be less than truthful about that. And, don't collect these data because this might make things look bad. And because of this ends justifies the means approach, that we really need to get this approved. So part of the critique was this cult-like vibe to the field.
Yeah, this individual, and I'll say one thing quickly, which is, I fully agree with you, particularly in this area, which opens up so much chaos, so much quote unquote transcendent chaos, right? That's what, unlike other drugs, you open up the spiritual, the mystical, the beyond normal everyday reality. And so in that particular case, it's very important to have strict boundaries and containers within that. There is no such thing as just unending chaos or unending transcendent reality. Like
we need boundaries,
right?
Like
you need boundaries. There is such thing as reality and ethics and rules and guidelines and principles to follow.
Right.
And I'm just like thinking like, oh yes, psychedelics, there are going to be crazies in the field. Catholic priests, Hindu gurus doing unethical things with their female participants. I mean, this just goes across every religion, every ideology ever.
Right.
And on the substance of what you just said, I want to make sure we get into some of these important things before we go. So this was Brian Pace, lecturer at Ohio State University. He described the company applying for approval, Lykos, as a therapy cult, and criticized Doblin's public comments highlighting his zeal for psychedelics and his belief that legalizing psychedelics would bring about world peace. This is from the Times piece again. So obviously you've talked a bit about that, but is that a concern?
I want to be really nuanced here because I have this general concern for the field. I can't say that I can't say that it's a therapy cult within like the work that Lykos did. That is a risk for the field, and this isn't a black or white thing. I think ultimately, like, I want to know exactly, I want any complaint fully like explored. And I don't have enough evidence of anything where there was a systematic, effort to skew things but if there was, like, we need to know. And I do know generally that that's a potential risk in the field. People have been writing about this since the 60s, like Masters in Houston, Sidney Cohen. They're like, there's a lot of extreme people in this field, and a lot of them are like so out there. They'd be willing to do anything. And like, there's some wild ones out there we got to watch out for. So we're repeating it's the same thing. So again, I don't know. I wouldn't, there's something to it as a general concern, but I don't have the evidence that I wouldn't have that characterization of Lykos. But is something going to come out that changes, like, potentially?
Yeah.
And I would say that it is a non-standard, even if that's not true. The kind of the transpersonal kind of quasi-religious vibe might be one reason why they went with this kind of idiosyncratic therapy of internal family systems, which this was another concern of the FDA panel, that, even though FDA is not charged with regulating psychotherapy, they had concern about the treatment, that it might have differed across the two treatment arms, and there wasn't enough compliance monitoring to like how the treatment was done, none of which FDA can even regulate. So I wish it hadn't been part of the discussion, but I would say that retrospective, and nothing against that, their the system in particular, they would have been safer going with as the psychotherapeutic backdrop, something that's more kind of scientifically studied and characterized, like prolonged exposure therapy or cognitive processing therapy, which are more recognized, scientifically established treatments for PTSD. It might have been a better strategy that could have prevented some of this, because the internal family systems, there's just not as much research on it, but it is in this kind of more, what you could call transpersonal, new agey, kind of a little more out there. I wouldn't use the language cult therapy, but it at least allows for critics who would say that to leverage that as a critique. It seems they would have been safer using more standard approaches in retrospect.
Yeah, and I'll just say, in my psychedelic therapy and integration, we have done IFS, internal family systems. I think most people listening to this will not know what that is, but in essence, it's basically a therapeutic modality of viewing yourself as having various parts, like an angry part, sad part, depressed part, and I just think that's just kind of subjectively true. And at least the form that I've gotten it in, it hasn't gone in any kind of extremist, super mystical, religious lens. But of course that is an obvious risk within that, and I don't know what I don't know. So theoretically, there could be IFS therapists very much doing things like that. And I have read into some accounts actually briefly. I would like to go deeper into it, of ideas of like the devil possessing you, those kind of things coming into IFS therapy and coloring the therapeutic process.
Right, which is a theoretical concern for at least a subset of people. Are they we had a bit of a pre-podcast discussion, like the use of metaphors. Like that might be a really good and useful metaphor, but ultimately there isn't an internal family. These are just descriptors for different tendencies that, sometimes you're operating more under this tendency, different aspects of your behavior, of your thoughts. So, but there's a risk in some people taking those metaphors too far and actually then being convinced that they're now have, or falling into multiple personality disorder and thinking they have these, like they're possessed by an entity and this type of thing. That's not going to be most people, but that is something that if it's not done well or with the wrong person, I could imagine being a risk.
Yeah, and from the IFS advocates, I would imagine they would say that being safer, which I think your point is valid, and maybe if I was the decision maker, maybe I would have opted on the safer side and chose something that's more empirically, clinically verified. But those IFS advocates, I feel like might say, that was a very important part of the therapeutic process, and puts people more into touch with difficult emotions and have self-compassion and work through those different parts that are manifesting in a disorder that we call PTSD, which involves nightmares, horrible memories in the past, things that people can't get over and can't compartmentalize mentally. I'm sure there's a case those people would make on that point.
Absolutely.
On top of that, I will say, in terms of like the religious zeal claim about Rick, Rick never shies away from talking about his own experiences, his own perspectives, a lot of optimism, a lot of exuberance, a lot of support, a lot of interest in this area. I think he's done incredibly compelling work.
I think he's an ethical. I haven't seen any evidence other than that he's an honest ethical. I think his passion is 100% genuine, and I've never seen anything to suggest that that he's putting people purposefully at risk as part of this kind of blind zeal and obsession that where he, any complaint should be, looked at, but it's not, it doesn't fit with my experience with the man and my knowledge of him. I think all of that is very genuine. Agree or disagree. Like that's,
And I will say that I think it's extremely unlikely that anything like that would surface, given what I have heard him say, which is that he did some kind of re-review, reanalysis of Timothy Leary's research.
Yeah, the Good Friday study and the Concord prison experiment, both. Yeah.
Yeah, and he found a number of errors and fallacies. And so as much as he was passionate about psychedelics and has done them and is optimistic about them, he was very clear that Timothy Leary had done a lot of unethical things within his research, and so he's done. He's talked about that.
I cited Rick recently on that work recently in a paper I submitted on psychedelic ethics. Like, he really set a great example of doing that.
So this guy, he's been very ethical and careful and honest about unethical research from considered the greats Timothy Leary, who also had a lot of ethical problems in their research. So it would be an incredible surprise for me for Rick having reviewed Timothy Leary and finding a lot of issues and something to come to surface that would suggest the same that Rick did. That just wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, I think it's hard to put together and it's like, and you're talking on stuff where you are going to get some level of like shitty therapists and unethical people that are
sure.
But unfortunately, we do get that in the practice of psychology, like in medicine. Like the rates of that happening are astonishing outside of psychedelics. I forget the exact numbers, but they're kind of jaw-dropping. They were surprising to me when I learned them about the number of therapists that will admit having developed a romantic relationship, not just attraction, but at some point, and so it's never excusable, and it's never that number should be zero, but we also have to realize that the only thing we can do is minimize. Like that will always be a risk, and so we would outlaw psychology, the practice of psychiatry, if we absolutely will take no risk. If we got to get that number to zero. So it's like, what can we possibly do? What can we do to minimize through the correct training, through the correct regulation, the correct rules, professional standards to make that as unlikely as possible. And when it does happen, to make sure it gets reported and that person gets nailed for it. They lose their license, they're brought up on criminal charges if appropriate.
Yeah. Now, so far, in our conversation, and I expected this, we haven't seen any, at least we haven't talked about any strikingly concerning issues that they've brought up. Functional unblinding issue. Let's go into that. As well as the ICER report, Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, a nonprofit that examines costs and effectiveness of medications, which issued a report and called the effects of the MDMA-assisted therapy treatment as inconclusive and questioned the study results. That was brought up in the study. And then the functional unblinding thing, for people who don't know what we're talking about, basically a problem that was raised that because MDMA is such a mind-altering substance, and people will know whether they have MDMA or not when it's causing a particular kind of psychological state. That there could have been this strong bias in individuals who, in the MDMA arm, within a few minutes, I got MDMA. They know they got MDMA without a doubt. And
just their expectation of healing based on that.
Their expectation of I'm in the MDMA group, not the placebo group. Therefore, my PTSD will likely get better. So they raise that concern of that potentially that expectancy effect has colored the positive outcomes in the MDMA group. So the ICER report and this issue, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's the most difficult thing to address because they actually presented some data that were really kind of they were compelling. The people that thought they got MDMA, the vast majority of those 49 did get MDMA, but 9 people who thought they got MDMA actually got and this was just from the second study. They didn't, I think, collect these data in the first of the phase 3 trials. 9 people got placebo and thought they got MDMA, but the average size of improvement for PTSD in those 9 people looked nearly identical to the improvement in people that thought they got MDMA who actually got MDMA. Now, there was a different distribution in the people that got placebo, the people that actually got MDMA and thought it was placebo, which was only 3, because that's a much less likely mistake to make once you get the real thing. You usually can reckon it's more likely to get a placebo and to be like, oh, maybe this is it, maybe it's not. When you get the real thing, it's like, oh, no, this is definitely it. But you do get 3 people.
And what was the placebo? What was the placebo again?
It was a true placebo, so just sugar pill, not an active
so it's not doing anything.
Right, so it's just not doing anything. And so you got 3 people that got the MDMA and thought it was a placebo. And so it was only 3 people though. But the level of improvement there on average was the same as the people who actually got MDMA and the people who got placebo who thought they got MDMA. And then it was only the people that got placebo that thought it was placebo that had the lower level of efficacy. Again, kind of hard to interpret that 3-person, group that I mentioned, but it does suggest, of course, there was some placebo effect, that expectancy drove some of the results. I would say in totality with what we know about the drug, it does not seem plausible that all of the results were driven by expectancy, because
or largely.
Yeah. Well, we know that. Yeah. Because we know there is a dramatic effect in the brain. I would argue we know more scientifically about the acute effects of MDMA than we know about SSRIs. Like there's still a lot of mystery there, but we know what's happening in the brain when someone's having a psychedelic experience. The real question is, that's not snake oil. That's not a placebo effect. The question is, are the long-term therapeutic outcomes all driven by a placebo effect, or is there some, something above and beyond that? To me, it seems obvious that there is, that it's not all driven by placebo effect, because what it does biologically in the short term is very consistent it's consistent with what we know at the psychological and neuroscientific level about how we process memories and about effective PTSD treatment. All of that fits. So I think the overall picture, I think it's pretty. But the other big thing that I'm really concerned about is that there is a whole host of drugs that have been approved. All of the sleep drugs, most of them, Zolpidem, which is Ambien, et cetera. All of the anti-anxiety benzodiazepines, the Xanax, et cetera, all of the ADHD drugs, the Adderalls, the Vyvanse, all of the opioid pain relievers. Like, the practice of psychiatry and medicine in general is filled with psychoactive drugs that have very clear signatures. This is a problem, and I don't actually have those data. They're hard to find, and I don't know. I'm curious. Someone reach out if you have. I want to know to what degree in FDA advisory panels this has come up when these anti-anxiety drugs, when these stimulants for ADHD, when these sleep medications, when opioid analgesics have come up. Because cutting through the blind is an issue with all of those. We think it's like an especially unique issue with psychedelics, but it's not. So one of the things, I don't think psychedelics should be held to a higher standard than the normal process. You
don't think so though? For if we compare MDMA to Ritalin or Adderall, with MDMA,
I think whatever standard on cutting things, it's going to be impossible to completely address this issue of cutting through the blind because it truly is more like a psychotherapy than it is like a traditional psychiatric medication. But for any psychoactive drug, at the levels that are likely to actually have a therapeutic effect, you're going to feel it. And so this is not unique. This particular issue, because they're functionally unblinded. Like a lot of studies, like the blinding isn't even assessed in these other drug classes. What I don't know about is like phase 3 trials and that have gotten approval, and then again, was this a question? But that's the thing for me. It's we can't hold this to a higher standard than other drug classes.
That's a really good point. Do you not think, and I agree with you fully, that's what I was thinking as well, but do you not think the case could be, that it could be possible that with MDMA, it's more, you could have more of an expectancy effect compared to, sleep medication or anti-anxiety medication where, someone who's in a lot of anxiety, did they get the anti-anxiety pill or a placebo versus with MDMA? Again, to me, it was quite implausible. Obviously, there were 3 cases where individuals were given placebo and they thought that MDMA, I don't know how that works, but it does work. It did happen 3 times. But with MDMA, you will know very clearly when you suddenly, the doors of your heart open up, metaphorically speaking, and you have that incredible, euphoric, ecstatic rush versus, say, anti-anxiety medication, which might not have as dramatic, sudden emotional effects.
But still, take 10 milligrams of Xanax, or take Ambien and stay up for an hour. Yeah. These are also very clear drug signatures too. They're not as dramatic, but in terms, the question is, are they recognizable?
I agree with you.
And these are very recognizable. Take take even 5 milligrams of Adderall. Like, these are very recognizable, subjective effects. So to me, that's the question. Even if the psychedelics are more captivating and philosophically interesting, it's like, can you feel that you're on it? And then in that sense, I don't know that they're that much different, to these other, like, that's a good point. Like, a good dose of amphetamine, they're cooking, their mind's going, like, they feel like they're on, and the example with all of these.
So you're saying the expectancy effect is an issue in all these drugs, number one, and number two, has that been properly teed out in the other?
Right. Are we holding ourselves to a higher standard? And also, it's like, we need to, expectancy isn't the same as, it's presumably part of what's behind the placebo effect, but it's not the same. You can actually measure, and one of the things they should have done in retrospect is measure expectancy. So literally how much, and this is the stuff Robin Carhart-Harris did in some recent work, comparing the psilocybin to an SSRI in depression. And he actually found that just a measure of how likely do you think, psilocybin or the SSRI is going to help you with your depression, that the correlation between expectancy, just a measure 1 through 10, something like that, and your therapeutic outcome was higher for SSRIs than it was for the psilocybin, where there wasn't actually even a statistically significant correlation. So it would have helped for Lykos to have had that type of data, which they didn't. So that's different. It's related, but it's different than assessing the credibility of the blind. But again, what I'm concerned about is if this is the standard, having perfect blinding, that will never ever approve any psychedelic, because it's an impossible standard to fully address. Like, you measure what you can measure and you do the best you can. And you have to assess it from there. I do have to go in just a minute, though. We're pushing my hard stop.
Yeah. Mine too. So I agree with you. The expectancy effect. I mean, is there anything that can be done on? Is anywhere
you could. And this was a point of, this relates to kind of the previous use of MDMA, which seemed clear didn't drive the results. But this issue about recognizing the drug or not, like, all else being equal, it's better to use people who have never taken MDMA or another psychedelic, so that could be done better. And then if you did have an active control, like, say, if you used amphetamine, like Adderall, as a control rather than a true placebo, that could fool, especially in drug naive people, that could fool a lot of people. Some of our early work at Hopkins used that approach, and so you could do it. Although there's always pluses and minuses. It's like, your safety signal is actually better. Your rates of AE assessment, adverse events, is better when you have a true placebo. But the blinding could be improved by, one of these other active placebo compounds. Like having oral THC would be a great one to potentially fool people whether they got the real thing or not. But
Yeah. Okay. But I think we're agreing the expectancy effect does not appear to have largely driven this effect.
I don't think so. When you take into account the way we know the drug works and as a totality, no, it doesn't seem credible that it's fully drove the long-term therapeutic effects.
Yeah.
But, that is more arguable than some of the other, concerns that they were focused on.
Yeah. And your point is that's a really good point. With the other medications, are they holding them to the same standard?
Yeah, and I don't think they are. We have to have a pathway forward. If this is theoretically helping people, how could we ever possibly show it to get this to patients?
Before we go, and I'm going to see if there's something else we can creatively figure out if we want to do more coverage on this in a separate way after this podcast. Anything else you want to hit, like any other concerns that, like, from everything we've talked about, none of these concerns are so egregious or striking that I would not recommend approval. Like all these things, like, there's something there that is concerning, but not to the level of recommending against approval. Is there? It seems like you agree with that. Is there anything else that was so absurdly didn't make sense, or anything on the valid side? Because so far I've not seen any striking.
Those are all the major things. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, unfortunately, I am up against a hard stop. I kind of got to go.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but we're happy to pick up on it any other time. Yeah.
I'm on break right now, and I'm going to be in the Swiss Alps the next couple of days. But were those kind of those are the major things that were brought up? That we talked about.
We went through every kind of I think major category of what the concerns were.
And so overall, you think that the committee should have morbid on the approving side.
Yeah, that's the way I would have voted.
Yeah,
but I, hope, in recommending a strong set of rules that could address some of these concerns. But yeah,
if you were on the committee, you would have approved it. Recommended approval at least. Again, last line I'll just say, I'm very concerned about what happened and just the hypocrisy and lack of principles. Again, the COVID vaccine example, which is my first experience with this, FDA, communicating with them, covering this, where was all the attention to safety and efficacy there? And here suddenly all these things, most of these things we talked about are not on the level of concerns that there were for the COVID vaccine. Right. So that to me is very, very troubling and goes to question the reliability and just principles of this agency.
Right.
When there's such a discrepancy between different drugs getting different treatment. And you mentioned the other drugs as well, which also have potential expectancy effects, but haven't been held to the same standard.
Right.
So, thanks for coming on, man.
Appreciate my pleasure.
Again.
Yeah.
Sorry, I really wanted to make this happen. I really wanted to make this happen, even though I was on vacation. And I appreciate you coming
Enjoy those Swiss Alps, man.
So,
that's the rule.
I will.
Yeah, great therapy.
It is. Yeah, my therapist did say, that's it's powerful therapy for me to be on. It's to vacation.
Very cool.
All right, thanks, man.
All right, my pleasure. Till next time.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.